So, one of the great things that we face every day of our lives, and I guess maybe not things, but one of the great questions that we face every day of our lives is this question: Is God truly in control? Of course, when we lose someone that we love, that question can obviously come up. There are other reasons that this might come up. It can even arise multiple times a day. Is God in control of the weather? When a cyclone develops and it hits a place like Mozambique and many are killed and more are injured, and is God in control over life and death when a crazed man will walk into a mosque in Christchurch and shoot up the place and dozens of Muslims are killed? Or when a man walks into a church and blows the place up in Nigeria, and our brothers and sisters go into eternity, is God in control of my job when things are not going the way that I was expecting them to go, and I was hoping that they would go, and things didn't turn out the way that they did? Or maybe even now it might be that we may have to even look for another job because we got fired. Is God in control of my loved one? When I want to get married, but there are no prospects, or when I am married, but maybe wish perhaps that I wasn't. Why does God allow these things to happen? Is God in control over these things? And really, those last two questions is God in control when I am single and want to be married, but I'm not married? And is God in control when I am married, but maybe I don't want to be married? That's kind of what we're looking at here this morning. And obviously, the answer is, because we are in church, right? And so we want to get that churchy answer, is that yes, what? God is in, what's the last word I'm going to say? Control. Absolutely, He is in control. We know that. It's not just because it's a churchy answer, but because that's what the Scriptures continuously speak to time and time again, that even when it seems like chaos, even when things are not going the way that we were hoping that they would go, God is absolutely 100% in control. That's the easy answer. The more difficult answer to deal with is why God does what He does the way that He does it. That's the more difficult. And sometimes the Bible will give us the answer, and sometimes God remains silent. This morning we're seeing that God at least gives some of the answer, part of the answer, if not the full answer here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Now, I was telling Paige that I really want to get into 1 Corinthians chapter 8. 7 is just a very long chapter. We've already been here. This is our second week. We've got 2 more weeks in chapter 7, just to give you guys a heads up, okay? And so there's a lot going on there in chapter 7 that deals with being married and being single. And so we're going to be taking a look at that again over the next couple of weeks. But I just really quickly want to get into some of that here this morning as we look at 1 Corinthians 7, 8 through 16, because we're going to see what God is doing inside of marriage. And so the name of this sermon is really called Content with God's Mission, because that's what God is doing in our marriage or in our single life, is He has us on mission. The problem is that oftentimes we neglect to see that. So hopefully we're going to see marriage in a little bit deeper way than we have before, and singleness in a little bit deeper way than we have before, because Paul makes the case that both in singleness and in marriage, one is to be ministering on behalf of Christ. And so we're going to look and see that being on mission for God really is, first off, it takes a contented person. So that's the first thing I'm going to look at, is the contentment of the person. And then we're going to look at those who are single. So the singleness, the person that is single, and then ultimately the person that is married. We're going to kind of be looking at that. So being on mission as a contented person, being on mission as a single person, being on mission as a married person. That's what we're going to be looking at. So if you will, please stand with me for the honor of the reading of God's Word. We're going to be reading verses 8 through 16. And to the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? You may be seated. Thank you. So I want to deal with being on mission first as a content person, a person who has contentment with where they are with their lot in life, right? Because if we are not content with where we are in life, if we are not content in our marriage or in our singleness, it will really be hard. It'll be very difficult for us to be able to focus on the mission that God has for us at hand. Because all that we are going to start to be focused on is our lot in life and how we are miserable in this lot in life, or how we don't want to be in this lot in life, or how we would rather be somewhere else, doing something else, rather than what God has given to us to be and to do. And so we become discontent in our singleness, or we become discontent in our marriage, and all of a sudden we have lost focus of the mission, starting to focus more on the marriage. We cannot allow ourselves to do that. We must be vigilant in our contentedness. Now, Paul doesn't actually state here anything really that we can look at as concrete and say, well, here he says you have to be content with your lot in life, because it's not it, right? We just read it. Did anybody pick up on any word that said, be content? So I didn't, right? I didn't find anything that really actually said contentment. So he doesn't really actually deal with contentment, but it's there within the scriptures. I don't want to say that we're reading in between the lines. We're going to look at how he says it, but he just doesn't say the word content in there. But first off, what we need to understand is that contentment does not mean and does not equal at all apathy. It's often that we begin to think about contentment, and it's easy to associate that with apathy. So I've got to be content where I am. So that means I really don't do anything, and I don't go, and I don't press on, and I don't push forward, and I don't try harder, and such like that. That's not what contentment means. It doesn't mean that you don't try hard. It doesn't mean that you can't go forward. It doesn't mean that your lot in life isn't going to change. It's not an apathy thing. It's like, oh, I'm just resigned to do whatever it is. It's not apathy at all. Apathy is really pretty much about not caring where God has you. There's absolutely, it means no sympathy or no emotion about it, right? It means I just really don't care. Contentment is, I do care. I do care where God has me, and I am looking forward to seeing what God's will is for me in the situation that I am at. And if God so chooses through His miraculous work, or through just my faithfulness, or through my pushing forward and such, and my endurance and such, that He is going to change my situation, then fantastic. But I do care. I absolutely care where God has me in my life right now. So I am content. I am not apathetic. I have care. I do absolutely care. Contentment is not so much based on where God has you as much as it is based on that God has you. That He is there for you. That He will never leave, never forsake. That He is not just dwelling in you, but He is comforting you. That He is enlightening you. That He is pushing you in the direction that He wants you to go. That He is making you and conforming you to be like Christ. This is why Paul could say that whether he had a lot, whether he abounded, whether he had a lot of money and a lot of resources, or he had like nothing, he was content. He had learned to be content because it wasn't so much the situation as it was that God was in that situation with him. So to the single person, and this would include those who have never been married, those who are divorced, those who are widows and widowers, the circumstance that you are in may be that of singleness. And you may long for marriage, long for your spouse to be with you again. And that's normal. And that's perfectly fine. And you can still be content with God in your situation because God has you. Because God has not left you and that God has not forsaken you. And that He is using you in that circumstance for His glory and for your good and for the good of others that He is using you to minister to. The married person may, at this moment, be miserable in their marriage. There may be things going on, and so the spouse is being distant, the spouse isn't there very much. Finances might be not in the best of situations. There may be something else that we don't even know about. And so there's this moment, or there are these times where one or maybe even both spouses begin to have this secret feeling of wanting out, and yet at the same time knowing that God is there in that situation, that God has not left them alone, that God is there to strengthen them through it. They can still be content. Because it's not the circumstance so much as it is the fact that God is in that circumstance using you for His glory, for your good, and for the good of others. So Paul doesn't actually use the word be content, the words be content in these verses, but we see the sentiments here. Look with me real quick. Go back to verse 8, starting at verse 8. So to the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good. It is good for them to remain single as I am. So it's good to remain single as I am. So therefore it's a good thing, right? It is a good thing to remain. So therefore there's this idea of contentment. I am going to let God do what God is going to do in this, right? Look at verse 11, where he says, but if she does, talking about this, the wife that might wants to separate, that divorce basically her husband, right? If she does, she should, again, there's that word, remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. So there's this idea of either be content being single for the rest of your life, or be content going back to your husband. One of those two ways, right? So either way, you're supposed to either remain content in your singleness, or you remain with your husband. There's this contentment, right? And so then we see in verse 12, he says to the rest, those who are still married, right? To those who haven't really been dealt with it here, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, she wants to live, she's okay with living with him, right? That he should not divorce her. He should be content with that situation. It's content that God is using him in that situation. Same thing would go vice versa, right? And the wife, if she is living with an unbelieving husband, she needs to be content with that situation because God is using her in that situation. And then verse 15. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. Be content with it. Let it happen. Let God work. Let God have His timing. Let God have His way. Just offer yourself up. Offer yourself up to let God use you. In other words, Paul is really just saying, let Corinthians need to be content with the lot that God has them. Because He is using the person within the circumstance, and He is with them, empowering them through it. So let us be content then. Let us be content with God's being with us and in us, and being used by Him again for His glory, for our good, for the good of others who we are ministering to. If we are instead focused on our circumstances, rather than being content, then we will lose focus. for the mission that God has for us. So there's this mission for the contented person, right? And then there's this mission for the single person, right? Now, Paul doesn't say a whole lot in this text here. He more or less basically, we're gonna get into verse 25, and that's when he really begins to talk about those who are single and everything. But I really want to just stop for just a moment, and just really focus here on what he says to the single person. Let's go back, verse 8 again, right? To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is a good thing, or it is good for them to remain single as I am. In Paul's day, it was a shameful thing for a person to remain single. Now today, we're kind of getting out of that, right? People aren't even getting married until their 30s and such, right? So, but in Paul's day, it was very shameful to not be married. Obviously, the women married at a very young age, probably around 12, 13, 14 years old, depending. And so they were expected to be, of course, a dutiful wife and such. But in some places, in Rome, they actually had the ability to divorce their husband if they wanted to. And they could give them a bill of separation, basically a bill of divorce, a writ of divorce that they could do. But of course, if that happened, both either man and the woman, or simply just the woman, but either one of them was expected to get remarried within 6 months. It wasn't a law that they had to be married, but it was basically a written rule. It was wisdom that had been passed on through the ages, through philosophers and such, that they should then basically get married within 6 months. And so they were always on the lookout. Even if it wasn't the best of marriages, even if it wasn't the best of partners or what have you, they were looking to always be married because it was a shameful thing not to be married. And Paul here is saying, hey, it's a good thing to not be married. It is a good thing for you to remain single, even as I am single. This goes right back to what Paul said in verse 7, right? Where he says, I wish that all were as I myself am. That's his prayer. That's his wish for everybody else. That they would remain single. That they would be single just like Paul is. But he says that it's not just simply a wish, but this is a gift that comes from God. Each has his own gift from God. Singleness is a gift from God. Marriage is a gift from God. But each one has his own gift from God, one of one kind, and one of another. Now, next week we're going to get into the next section of this. We're starting in verse 17, but let's quickly look at verse 17. Because he doesn't just say that this is a gift from God, but he says it's a calling from God. Verse 17, only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to them. Sounds a lot like being content, right? A lot in life. And to which God has called him. It is a gift, and it is a calling. So a single person, one who is single at this moment, should look at his or her life and see that this is a gift and a calling. It may not feel that way, but that is a gift and it is a calling. And so they should focus on those aspects. What is it why has God gifted me with this, and what is it then that God is calling me to in my singleness? And really everyone actually in the church ought to focus on this. When I preached on this back in May of last year, so I kind of feel like I'm repeating myself a little bit here. But that's okay, right? Because we don't always, get it the first time. But so one of my takeaways though was basically this, was to remind us that since this is a gift, since this is a calling, then we as a church, as God's church, ought to celebrate it and not to shame it. Right? We ought not to be the one that goes to the person and makes them feel shame for being single. We ought not to go to the one who is single and ask them if they're seeing anybody or if they ever are going to be planning on getting married. Right? Because this is God's gift. This is God's calling, and it should be a gift that is going to be in joy. It is a calling that ought to be looked at and focused on to see where God is leading. So we as a church, we ought not ever strike the chord of discontentment into the heart of God's child. Like I said, in a couple of weeks we're going to be dealing with verses 25 through 40 that really begins to deal with a lot of this area of singleness. But quickly, we need to focus on the idea that this is a calling and a gift. Because the unmarried are not, and we're going to get here in just a second, so we're going to go to, I think, about verse 32 and 34 in just a second, but we need to understand that the unmarried, the single, has the ability to do that which we as married people, we can't. Because our hearts are really ultimately in two different directions, right? Because we've got to focus on our spouse, we have to focus on our children, so there's time that we have to spend with our spouse and with our children and such, and then of course we want to be there and so, for God and to minister on behalf of God, and yet we've got a decision to make. You know, how much time are we going to spend doing the Lord's work outside of the home and then doing the Lord's work within the home? The single person doesn't have that. They can spend so much of their time, and that's Paul's point, is that they can spend so much of their time not having to divide it between a sick child and Bible study, or a sick child and evangelism, or a spouse who is very needy and going out and doing missions work. They don't have to stop and think, okay, well, I want to go and I want to do short-term mission, or I want to do long-term mission, but what does that mean for the rest of my family? Because it's easier to uproot the life of one person than it is to uproot the life of 5 or 6 or 7 people. What if one of them doesn't want to go? What if they're going to be miserable if we did go? The one who is single has the option to be able to do that. They can stay out later, they can leave earlier, they can bring home ministries and work on it in their spare time. They have more of their own money at their disposal for the work of the Lord, for the mission, than a person who has to feed 5 mouths or clothe 5 bodies. They can do more on missions, they can give more to missions, they can go more on missions. They have that ability because they have nothing that would tie them home. Look at me real quick, 32. Verse 32. I want you to be free from anxieties. Because the unmarried man is anxious about things of the Lord and how to please the Lord. And then we go to verse 34, right after, there's a little bit from verse 33 that continues into 34, but it says, and the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. They don't have these anxieties that the married folk might have. They're gifted, they are called onto God's mission in the lot that they are in. And some are called and gifted for a short time, and some are called and gifted for a long time, and some are called and gifted with singleness for their entire lives. But it is a calling and it is a giftedness, a gifting, and it is to be used for the mission that God has them for. But he does make a concession here, right? Because we see in verse 9, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Right? Now, how do you know if basically that God has gifted you and called you to singleness? Well, some of it, in part at least, is going to depend ultimately on your sex drive. Right? This isn't to say that single people never have sexual urges. Right? But a telltale sign of the gift of singleness is that they can control those urges. Right? So in Paul's day, it's like they're not running to the temple prostitutes because they have this urge, right? They're not doing that. They're able to control that. Or if it was today, right, they're not getting caught up in the internet and the pornography there or reading salacious novels or what have you. They're not doing that in our day, right? They're able to control those urges. If they're not able to control those urges, then yeah, they really need to start focusing on finding a spouse. But the singleness is, if the one is able to do that, then embrace the fact that God has called you and gifted you to this, forever how long it may be. But if those desires are there, those urges are there, and they're uncontrollable, then yeah, maybe you haven't been called. And it is better than to marry than to ruin your testimony. To lose focus of your mission. So most of this text, though, is about married. So he says here, starting at verse 10, to the married I give this charge, that I, of the Lord, the wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. The husband should not divorce his wife. So obviously, being first century Christians, and 1 Corinthians is one of the first letters that we have that Paul wrote. Maybe the first that we have, but maybe second or third. But this is a very early letter that he has written to the Corinthians. And so obviously at this point in time, there are going to be very few people who were born into Christian families, right? So ultimately what happens then is within these families, within this marriage situation, you're going to have either the husband getting married, or the husband getting saved, or the wife getting saved. Sometimes maybe both of them got saved, but you're generally going to have maybe one or the other that are part of this Corinthian church, right? So one of them is saved, the other one is not saved, and so therefore there's going to be some friction there. And Paul understands that. And it's very tempting for somebody to look at that situation where there is all this friction, because especially if you're a wife, which is why he starts dealing with the wife first before he starts dealing with the man, but especially if you're a wife, you're almost duty-bound to actually worship whatever God your husband worships. Doesn't always happen that way. There are times when that didn't happen, but generally that was the expectation. And so if you're a wife and you were worshiping the same God that your husband was worshiping, and all of a sudden you get converted to Christ and you start following after Christ and you're no longer worshiping that God, there's going to be some friction there. And the wife very well could look and go, you know what, this is just too much, and I could just walk away from it all. I could just then, like Paul says, I can just focus on the ministry. I can focus on what Christ wants. I just need to walk away from it. And I have that ability to just walk away. Paul says, no. You don't. As much as that would alleviate some of the heartache, as much as that would alleviate some of the tension, it's not what we've been called to be. It's not what we've been called to do. Can we live with contentment even in a marriage that might have some strife? So Paul charges them with the same charge that Jesus gave. In essence, basically what God has joined together, let no man what? Separate. Same word, right? Separate. You are not to separate. You are not to divorce your husband. Divorce wasn't even an option. If one did get divorced, then they had really two options at that point. Either reconcile, which is the preferable, right? To reconcile with the husband, or basically to stay single. If a wife then decided that she was going to stay single, she risks, of course, that shame that we talked about, because they were looking at getting remarried within 6 months. But she also looked at having to be on her own, which was not something that most women did back then. They had to care for themselves. They had to rely on what they could do and on their abilities, not on the husband's job. And the reason is because divorce commits adultery. That's what Jesus brings up, right? Go with me real quick, Matthew 19:9. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. Same thing would be for the wife. If the wife were to divorce her husband and went out and got remarried, that ultimately is committing adultery. And while I'm not going to be able to go into a whole lot of detail here, Jesus is pointing back to Deuteronomy chapter 24. And basically in that section there, that Moses is allowing for divorce, it basically allows for divorce during the betrothal period, and therefore not after. If you are betrothed and you ultimately find out somehow that your wife has been unfaithful to you, you are able then to divorce her. But once the consummation of the marriage has occurred, basically you're in it. There is no more divorce. If you were to divorce, then you are going to be committing adultery, is what Jesus ultimately says, because what God has joined together, let no one separate. His plan was for one man, one woman, for life in the bonds of marriage. So therefore, the believing spouse is to be content living with the unbelieving spouse. That doesn't mean, it doesn't give credence, doesn't give license to go and marry, for a Christian to marry an unbelieving spouse. Doesn't at all, right? Missionary dating, out of the question. Missionary marriage, or marrying, is out of the question. But the missionary marriage is something that is very real. When there is one who is in that marriage as a believer, they're called to stay in that marriage and to minister, be on mission for Christ. Look at verse 12. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord. But if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, he should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. But, as it is, they are holy. So at this point, Paul is writing here. He's expounding upon what Jesus has said. Therefore, he's saying that it says he that is saying, it's not Jesus. Jesus didn't directly say these things, but Paul is pulling from them. So it's just as authoritative, right? It's not like this is any less authoritative than what Jesus has said. This is just as authoritative for us. So he says, I'm not the Lord, right? But Paul's next words are still authoritative, right? And it is part of God's word. And therefore, the married, those who are married and they are married with their unbelieving spouse, they ought to be content with what they are going through because this is their mission field. And so these verses can be confusing, right? And they have been debated over and over again. Exactly what does it mean when you've got your unbelieving spouse, and therefore the wife can make her husband holy, or the husband can make his wife holy, even though they are unbelievers. What in the world does that all mean? And it's been debated probably since Paul actually even wrote the words. Exactly what does it mean? And everybody has their different opinions on it, but basically, suffice it to say that there's probably, ought to be anyway, in your life, nobody that has more influence on you directly than your spouse. Because you are with them more than anybody else. So there ought to be something that rubs off. Something that they see. That the unbeliever has access to the living gospel right before them. A representative, an ambassador of Christ who lives with them and sleeps with them and eats with them. As William J. Thomas once wrote, he says, be careful how you live. You may be the only Bible some person ever reads. I mean, the unbelieving spouse has become one flesh with the believer. They have literally entered into God's temple. So, generally speaking, the greatest influence ought to be the spouse on the husband or the wife's life. Anybody ever watched Godfather before? Anybody ever seen Godfather? Long time ago? Couple of you. Really? Watch the TV version. Don't watch the Netflix version. Wait for it to come on television. I just actually recently saw it, and I just found it hilarious. Not that Godfather's not hilarious, but there's always these parts in The Godfather that I found just to be funny, and this happens in almost any way. It really is true to life in some ways. Everybody, whether they were rich or poor, right? Whether they were powerful or not really powerful, they would bow the knee, basically, to the Godfather, right? To Vito Corleone. And they were just like so petrified of him. Except for those apparently that ultimately assassinated him. But otherwise, everybody else was pretty much petrified. But there's always one person that could say whatever they wanted to say to him and didn't really fear any of the consequences. Guess who that person was? His wife? Yeah, his wife. His wife could yell at him. His wife could slap him upside the head, right? His wife could do almost anything that she really wanted to him. And he was like always attentive at that point in time. He was always, giving her, he never fought back. He just let her say what she wanted to say and then smack him if she wanted to smack him and everything. And then never put out a hit on her or anything like that, right? So there's always that one person in that person's life that has more influence than that person even has on other people. Generally it is the spouse. Now, I'm not saying wives to go up and slap your husband and yell at them and scream at them and curse them out or anything like that. That's not you do that. That's all movie stuff. That doesn't happen in your life, right? Right? But the wife ought to have, somehow, because just being around them, being able to share that gospel, even if they are not able to use the words, right? That's why Peter says that sometimes we have to be that living gospel, that we submit in silence and we live with them in silence so that they may see the word live through us. Because that's our mission. Husbands, right? Peter says to live with your wife in an understanding way. Understand where they're coming from. Understand their hesitations. Understand what's going on. And so the family becomes the mission field, the first mission field for husband and for wife. Point Paul brings up the children, right? He includes the children here. They too have the advantage of a believing parent, right? We talked about it in Sunday school. It was kind of funny that Bruce would talk about it. But you're talking about Timothy in Sunday school. I planned to talk about Timothy in my sermon, right? And we see in Acts where Timothy comes alongside comes alongside Paul, and yet what we see about him is that he had a Jewish believing mother and he had a pagan Greek father. And yet he was Paul's dearest friend. He was the one who followed Paul, and he was the one who was a partner of Paul's, and was able to send out and had the same mind as Paul and such. That why? Well, Paul tells us in 2 Timothy the reason is because of his grandmother and his mother. He was their mission field. So, if you are in that marriage, be content to be in that marriage, to be used by God for the goodness of your spouse. Doesn't mean that they're going to get saved. In fact, God may not even use you in that situation. We don't know. The promise is that His word will not return void, but we don't know exactly how that word is going to work in the life of the unbeliever. So God may not use that situation. The spouse ultimately may want to leave. And Paul writes here that starting in verse 15, but if the believing partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. Let them go, right? Be content with the lot that God has given you and the lot that God has now given you, right? You've gone from being married, ultimately, now yes, you are a divorcee. But He's given you peace. That tension that was always there is done. It's gone. You don't have to worry about it. Let them go. Don't beg them to stay. Don't chase after them. Enjoy the peace that God is calling you to have. He says you're no longer bound to them. Lawfully, you are no longer bound to them. You are no longer enslaved to that marriage or that marriage partner. If they are the ones who leave you, let them go. Be nice about it. You don't have to say don't let the door hit you on the way out, but that's kind of the sentiment here. Just let them go. And then the next sentence here, verse 16, it's a little bit hard to figure out because the question ultimately becomes, is Paul talking about the people who are in the marriages and therefore they are on mission, hoping to save their spouse and children, or is he talking about those who have just been left by their unbelieving spouse? It's hard to tell exactly what it is that he is referring to, and so again, there's some debate about this, but I think he's talking to both. For how do you know, verse 16, how do you know, what wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? If it goes with that first section, right, that you are the wife or the husband that is with the unbelieving spouse and such, then it sounds basically like this. Be content to live with with the unbelieving spouse because you don't know if God will use you to save their souls. You are the greatest influence in their lives, and it is likely that God will use you to bring them to Christ, right? That's kind of what it sounds like. I mean, how encouraging is that? Wonderful, right? If we can just focus on that, if we can focus on that one day, maybe God will lead them to Christ through me. That would be so amazing. So I will stay in this marriage, and I will work on this marriage, and I will do what I need to do in order that maybe, hopefully, possibly, God will lead them to Christ. But it could also go with the second section, and it probably does. It probably works with both, right? Because then it sounds like this. If the unbelieving spouse leaves, let them go. Don't beat yourself up about them not being saved, right? Don't fret over it, because you don't know if God would have used you to save your spouse or not. Let God handle it. Those can be just as encouraging and just as freeing of words than to the one who is still in their marriage. Because it is very likely that the believer who has lived with their spouse, their unbelieving spouse, for months or for years or however long it might be, can beat themselves up because maybe if I had just done a little bit more, maybe if I had said this, maybe if I had done this, maybe if I could just go back and bring them back and just beg them to come back, maybe God will use me to save them. And Paul's like, let them go. God is sovereign. You don't know. God has called you now to peace. Let him be sovereign. If they will be saved, they will be saved. You have done your part. You have witnessed. You have been the living gospel before them. Now it's time to let him go. And all of this, we still live with that idea of contentment. Let God use each of us, right? Married or single, it doesn't matter, right? In an ideal or non-ideal marriage. And so let us live the gospel for our spouses, whether they are believers or not. Let us live God's word before our children, that they may be influenced by our holiness and our God-given righteousness. Let us be on mission, whether it's to family or to friends or to neighbors or to the othermost parts of the world. Let us keep that perfect, crucified, resurrected Jesus at the forefront of our minds. In everything that we do, in all of our circumstances, that we may be content with God's mission at every moment in our lives.